Hello, Arsenal Pass listeners, and welcome to this brand new Arsenal Pass limited time only podcast. As the name suggests, a podcast about all things limited in flesh and blood. This is season one, and we're focusing on Outsiders season of Limited. This will run for the next 10 weeks. It's a podcast series where it features me as the host, Hayden Dale, with a plethora of amazing guests, very experienced limited players, some of the best limited minds in the game of flesh and blood that'll be joining me to talk about all things from sealed, draft strategies, the heroes and outsiders, and how to get the most out of this outsiders format, level ups, and just all things limited, really. So in episode one, we're talking pre-release primer, how to go and win your pre-release with one of North America's top limited players, calling Krakow winner, Yuanji Li. Let's get into it. All right, welcome to the pod, Yuanji Li. Yuanji, it's awesome to have you on for episode one of Limited Time Only. Maybe for those that don't know who you are, they clearly didn't listen to Attack for 20, but do you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your journey in Flesh and Blood?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, my name is Yuanji. I've been playing Flesh and Blood ever since, right before Monarch came out. I got introduced to the game by Michael Fang, who I think if you're watching Arsenal Pass, he was on another episode talking about Uprising. And basically just trying to be, one of the best Flesh and Blood players out there while also giving good information to the people. And speaking of Attack for 20, we are trying to revive it right now. I'm starting a new Flesh and Blood team called Runaways. And we just finished our roster for the Baltimore Pro Tour. And one of the things that we're going to be doing is we're going to be releasing some podcast episodes to kind of help people level up in both constructed and limited.
Super exciting. So who have you got for Baltimore? I mean, you're in the East Coast, right? So you're in kind of like the hub of what I would call the hub of North American Flesh and Blood. You know, you're just near Michael Fing. I know there's Michael Hamilton,
Yeah,
and those guys aren't far away as well. So who have you got for Baltimore on Runaways?
yeah. So our core team, the people that we started the team with is me, Cody Williams, Neil Rakowski, and Trey Martin. And for the Pro Tour Baltimore, we're adding a couple of people from near where Shane lives in the Midwest. I think Timothy Long and Lucas Oswald, as well as we're adding from New Jersey area. New Jersey, like Pittsburgh, it's Charles Dunn, Pat Eschke, Michael Dalton, some other people are also in the works. So it's a pretty large team in the making, but hopefully we'll all do pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, that team sounds stacked. I know a lot of people listening might not be familiar with some of those names, but I mean, even someone like Cody, who's had numerous top eights and just seems to sneak under the radar. I'm not really sure how he does it, but he seems to sneak under the
Yeah.
radar. And Michael, Dalton, I know as well. And just, yeah,
hmm
Pat Eschke, of course, and that sort of group of, I know they've had it was with Craig for a while, right? And that kind of group from their area. So, just
Yep.
really talented and really experienced. I think majority of your roster, it sounds like, have been at most of the Pro Tours and Worlds, I think, and maybe Luke is the exception, but a phenomenal player as well.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of not only from Flesh and Blood, but also previous trading card game experience. So hopefully looking to make a splash at Pro Tour Baltimore.
Yeah, very exciting. And for those that don't know, I mean, the first time I met you, Yuanji, was actually at Pro Tour New Jersey, and I remember us having a conversation, and you said, do you mind if I put your face, or rather, not your face, on some sleeves?
Oh, yeah. You always gotta ask. I still have those sleeves. I have some boxes left.
I have the box you gave me. I've used them for. Mainly use them for pre-releases, actually. So they'll get an
Yeah,
outing in a week's time with the
yeah.
Outsiders pre-release. Did you ask Tarek for his permission? It's mostly him, to be fair, on that sleeve.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I should have. I messed up.
If you haven't seen these sleeves, it's the infamous picture from Pro Tour 1 where LSS gathered, or Channel Fireball, whoever it was, the event organizer, gathered all of the calling winners and nationals winners for a big photo, and Tarek put his big mitt across my face, and it's just the outline of my face, and then Tarek's hand, and it got memed on quite a bit, so it was a good time. But anyway, Yuanji, we're here to talk about Flesh and Blood Limited on limited time only, of course. Who would have thought? And we're going to talk in
There's
this
a new
episode.
set.
We got a big new set. Makes sense. We're going to talk about Outsiders and Sealed in particular heading into this pre-release weekend, how to win your pre-release effectively. We're going to break down some of our sort of tips and tricks and some of our early thoughts on Outsiders. Me and Yuanji, just before we jumped on, we're talking about some of the things we'd sort of already sort of discovered or thought about for the Sealed format. Before we ask, just general thoughts on Sealed. I mean, Sealed has kind of had a bit of a bad rap in Flesh and Blood because of particularly formats like Uprising and Monarch. What are your kind of thoughts on Flesh and Blood Sealed, and do you think that with Outsiders we have potential to sort of open a new chapter of Sealed for Flesh and Blood?
So I think the important thing is like why sealed even a format in the first place. And I think what sealed does is it gives any player, like, you don't have to do a lot of research going into it. You don't have to know like everything. Like basically there's no like drafting portion. You just get the cards and you play with the cards that you open. And I think with that respect, it probably doesn't offer like the depth of experience or the depth of play that like draft formats give. But I do think that as long as the games are interesting, then I think that's the most important thing. And I think why they choose to do sealed for like pre-release is it gives any player, no matter what your experience is, kind of like a little bit more straightforward way to get in and play some games of Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, and did you get to play any Monarch or Uprising? Like, did you have any? Sorry, Tales of Aria Uprising, like, or Monarch even? Because I actually didn't mind the
Mhm.
Monarch Seal format. I actually liked playing that format. I think Tales of Aria and Uprising were a little bit of a tougher sell.
I have played every sealed format, I think, for all the sets that have come out this game. Actually, I first started playing this game when Michael introduced. All we had were Arcane Rising boxes, so we just played a lot of Arcane Rising sealed.
Uh
It was a interesting time. But actually, I think that there are some kind of callbacks to those kinds of formats in the new set. I think overall, yeah, Flesh and Blood Seal does get kind of a bad rap. I think mostly just from the more enfranchised players because like it's like pretty straightforward because there's usually like one or two heroes that are like the best heroes to build. But I think it like goes both ways, right? Like if it's pretty straightforward to build, like like these are the good heroes, then for anybody who's listening or watching, then they can feel pretty prepared going into playing their pre-release.
Yeah, and potentially how to exploit those as well, right? Like, not strengths are strengths, but there's also weaknesses with some of these heroes as well. So
Yep.
cool. Why don't we start by talking about just some of the core fundamentals of Sealed deck? And a lot of people who are maybe newer to Flesh and Blood, or what I found with Flesh and Blood as well, a lot of people are newer to TCGs and totals, and they might not have had the Sealed experience before. So why don't we just talk a little bit about what Sealed deck is and kind of some of the like core fundamentals when we open our packs on pre-release day and what we kind of do first. So I mean, obviously you're going to get your 6 packs is what you get in Flesh and
Mhm.
Blood Sealed. You need to build a minimum 30 card deck. You can choose any of the heroes available in this format, the young heroes to play, the tokens, and you get access to all the token weapons. So if you don't open the new pack, you don't worry about it. You can still grab those token weapons. The TO will make sure they're there for you. But Yuanji, I want to ask you, what's the first thing you do when you start to open these packs? Do you have a particular process when it comes to opening your packs, other than obviously being like, what legendary did I crack?
Yeah, you gotta always look out for especially with the pre-release, you want to try to pull some of the new stuff. But yeah, the first thing that you should do when you're kind of playing your pre-release, maybe it's like your first time playing sealed, is so all the cards at the bottom, they tell you like what class or type of cards they are. So you want to do like a rough sort. So it's a little bit more complicated, I think, in this set because you have the hybrid cards. But I would just try to, when you're first opening the packs, just take your time. Pull aside all of the generics, all the ranger cards, ninja cards, like group them by which class they belong to, and then you can keep the hybrid cards, I guess, like in between. So you make like 3 piles, one for each class, and you put the hybrid cards in between, and then you have the generics to the side. And I think if you do like the sorting, I mean, most of the time in Flesh and Blood, like you kind of want to play like all the cards that you can play. It's usually beneficial. So Michael Fang told me this when we first started playing the game. Honestly, like most of the time when you're picking like what hero to play in Seal, it's not bad to just like pick the pile that has the most cards. It's like a quick and fast heuristic. And then I don't know. That's kind of how I would go at it at first.
And are you saying in your experience you play all the cards you can play, like over 30 cards, or are you trimming some cards? Are you trying to play 30 cards only? What does it look like for you in Seal when you start to build?
Mm, so if you want to go like a little bit deeper, so like I think usually if a card is at all like good, then I would lean towards putting it in. And I know if you come from other card games like Magic or is the big one. I think that you want to try to stay as close to like the minimum card size for consistency. But Flesh and Blood is kind of unique in the sense that all the cards are modular. Like you can, if you can't like play with them during attack, you can also block with them for the most part. And so because you have this kind of flexibility, it's really hard to draw like a card that's like a pure dead card in your hand. And so it's usually better to just have more total cards available to you.
Yeah, I felt the same, and especially my kind of first take on Outsiders, and we'll dive into the set more specifically, but this set feels more similar to sets like Arcane Rising as opposed to sets like maybe Tales of Aria Uprising, which were really quick and very powerful. It does feel like you're going to see, even if you play 33, 34 cards, you're probably going to see majority of your deck in most games. So that's been my early take on Outsiders anyway. So I completely agree. I think, if you're kind of weighing up the last 2 or 3 cuts in your deck to get to 30, if you're at that stage and these cards feel pretty similar in power level, you want them in your deck, you should probably just play them, I think.
Yep.
What about, I guess, so one of the things actually you just talked about laying out to piles. I think one of the cool things you can do in the set is if you chuck Assassin in the middle of your 3 piles and you have Ninja and Ranger on the outside, you've got a nice little avenue for your hybrid cards because Assassin is in both the hybrids. It's Assassin Ninja hybrid and Assassin Ranger hybrid, so you can easily do that. So also really recommend doing that, and then maybe laying down your like equipment along the top. Do you find that your equipment is going to sway what you play, or are you more looking at like the depth of your pile? You're looking at the quality of maybe your reds, like your what people might consider like ways to win the game, your power cards.
So I think it varies from set to set how important equipments are. Like I think if we're talking like Tales of Aria, I felt equipments were pretty important. Just because some of them are very powerful. Whereas I think for Uprising, like it just like you wanna I mean like for both of those sets, like you wanna play like the most powerful hero, but like something that might move you off is like if you have like all the equipments, let's say. Equipments are a kind of unique thing to the game of Flesh and Blood because you always start the game with them. So let's say if you have the choice between playing assassin or playing ninja and you have let's say like 3 more pieces of gear for ninja than for assassin, you're basically starting the game with like 3 extra health, or like give or take. And so that's like quite a good advantage to have. So if you're have a tiebreaker.
Yeah, someone was like explaining this to me earlier when I was sort of looking at like limited Flesh and Blood and thinking about the power of the equipments. It's like, imagine if you had your best card in your deck, but it had like attacked on like +3 power or something, and you knew that was going to hit, or it had an extra 3 defense that you knew you could utilize. Like you get this equipment that starts on the field. It's really high value, and sometimes it's a bit hard, especially if you're newer to the game, to really assign a value to it. But a card that starts on the board is just always going to be more useful than I think people generally realize. And there's some good abilities in the set, but maybe they're not quite, Plume of Evergrowth or card.
Yeah. Fair enough.
So we've laid out our piles. We start to look through, like, what are there, you talked about, I guess, just piles that have the highest amount of cards, ones that have the red cards in them. Is there anything else that you're looking for? Like, one thing that springs to mind, particularly for Outsiders, and we can just use this as a quick example, right, is if I want to play Ninja, I probably want some number of 0-cost blues, right, to be able to trigger the go again on my Kodachis. Is there anything just in general that you're looking for when it comes to sealed piles?
Yeah, so I think for each class that you're playing, it's a little bit different. Without getting like too high level, I think that like you said for ninja, it's really important to have 0-cost blues and yellows because you really want to be attacking with your weapons as often as possible. I think similarly for assassin, you kind of want to have a decent number of blues. I think assassin usually ends up playing a little bit similar to guardian in that respect. Like you want to have a blue because like being able to attack with your weapon and applying a debuff to your opponent is really how you kind of get past a lot of like the maybe like what's it called, uh shortcomings for a lot of the assassin card pool. And then for Rangers, I think the big thing that I'm looking for is just do you have a density of high power cards, meaning like just like cards that have power attached to them. So all the generics that have like 5 or 6 power, I think are pretty important. And arrows, like red arrows, buffs for your arrows. And the main reason for that is that because Ranger doesn't have a weapon that you can kind of fall back on, you really need to make sure that you have enough damage total in your deck so that if your opponent decides to kind of turtle up that they can't block you out.
Yeah, like if you think across the course of the game, ninja or even assassin with Kadachis and spider's bites, if you're able to get through 4 or 5 damage with those, maybe it's a little bit less, maybe it's a little bit more, but say around 4 damage, that's a big chunk. That's another full red card in your ranger deck that's hitting as well. Or if you think about it as leak damage, that's another 4 arrows that you need to leak 1 damage over the top. So it is that idea of looking for these reds and yellows that have density and breakpoints and ranger, I think, is something that's going to be really important in the seal format.
Mhm.
All right, so you've opened your cards, you've looked through your pool, you've started to decide what you want to build. Is there anything else that you think is really important once you start to lay this out? Like, how do you start to, when you're actually putting the deck together, is there anything else that you're kind of looking at? Are there any things that you have as considerations when you've chosen your hero and you're starting to put the deck together?
Yeah, I think it's good to have like an expectation of what your deck is probably going to look like going into it. So because I think that the packs end up breaking out pretty consistently in Flesh and Blood, meaning that you get like about the same mix of like cards for each like particular class. Uh, what will end up happening when you're deciding, oh, should I keep this card in? Should I take it out? Is just to see like whether or not it functions well with your hero. And most of the time, like for the most part, like all of the cards that are within your class are going to be the ones that you almost always will include in your deck because for the most part, they have designed them so that they are either like at worst like a block three, usually are like fit well with like how your hero wants to work. So you want to look at your generics to see like, oh, maybe this generic fits with my game plan, maybe it doesn't. The other thing that I would just like make sure is that you have enough blues. So I think that the math works out to be if you have about 9 or 10 blues in a 30-ish card deck, that you should see about like one every turn. Uh, so making sure like if that's what you want to be doing, like making sure that you have enough blues to fit in there. Maybe you have a generic card that you would rather not play, but because it functions as a resource, you just like keep it in.
Yeah, yeah. There's been a bit of a, I guess, this is a very long-standing TCG debate. I think when it comes to sealed, it kind of came up a lot in Magic, but I think it comes up a lot more in Flesh and Blood because of the nature of the modality of the cards, like you talked about earlier. Is this idea of synergy of the cards that you open in sealed, and what I mean by this is the interaction of maybe two cards that work together really well. So if I think Ranger in the set, it could be something like Scout the Periphery and an arrow in particular to sort of, and with Riptide to have that sort of synergy, or it could be a stealth attack that has an on-hit effect with your pumps, with your attack reactions, versus
Yeah.
just like good power cards, good cards that have in that bottom left hand corner a good number. Like, what do you think is the kind of balance between those things?
I think usually sealed ends up leaning towards you want to play like the power cards rather than the cards that require like specific sequences, just because like you just don't have like the same like mix. So like I said, like your expectation is about like half of your deck or maybe like a little bit less than half of your deck is going to be generics. So those cards automatically aren't going to necessarily like fit with exactly with like your game plan, but there might have just be like pretty good rate, like you pay 2 and you get 6 damage, right? And I would lean more towards playing as many of the cards that just like function well on their own. And the nice thing about Flesh and Blood is that you have access to like this arsenal spot. So when you do have a card that, let's say, like that buffs like arrows, like there's some rares in Ranger,
Mhm.
then you can kind of, the more good cards that you play, the more flexibility you have to actually keep that card that only works well with like one or two other cards in your deck.
Right, as opposed to spending it as soon as you can to get it to a relevant sort of damage threshold to put it on your
Yeah,
yellow arrow or whatever, as opposed to just
yeah,
playing your 5 good red arrows and just having good generics in your deck.
yeah.
Yeah. I think that's kind of been my takeaway from Sealed. More and more I've played Flesh and Blood, that bottom left hand corner, because of the repetitive nature of things like, if you compare it to Classic Constructed, you build your deck for consistency, right? Like, consistency is such an important thing in Flesh and Blood, and in Sealed you're really limited to what you can do. You're having to plug and play with different sort of aspects, and you're going to have these, like, maybe you do have some synergy, but it's probably going to be like 4 or 5 different things that synergize in different ways, as
Yeah,
opposed to the same thing repetitively. So yeah,
right.
I think it's more about that bottom left hand corner. What about, we can move on to outsiders, and I want to talk specifically about like some of the more viable strategies and what you're sort of leaning to. But Big question in sealed, and I think this can vary format to format. First or second, if you win the die roll, what are you choosing?
Yeah, it like varies from set to set. So I actually think for outsiders, probably first should be better. So generally, like the rule of thumb that I have for Flesh and Blood is that if your opponents want to block more and you think that the game is going to be more about like the total like number of cards that you have in your deck being important, then it's better to take like the first attack because usually attacking cards spend you usually spend fewer cards on attack than you do on defense. So an example is if you attack for 6 and your opponent blocks 2 cards, they're spending 2 cards in their deck versus you spending 1 card. And so you get the advantage that way. Whereas in a lot of the formats that we've had more recently, it's been more about like racing. Like you can't actually like get to a point where you're gonna end up using all your cards. And so in those cases, it's better to go second.
Yep. Yeah, I think I'm fully in agreement. I think Uprising, Tales of Aria, even to an extent, depending on the matchup, and Monarch, definitely it felt like going second was just like almost always correct. Because the other way I look at it is like, if I choose to go first, how likely is my opponent to be able to use all 4 cards offensively when they draw back up to push damage?
Mhm.
And a
Yep.
set like this, a set like Arcane Rising, it feels a lot lower. Like you're saying, it's more likely that they're going to want to defend with some number of those cards. And if they go second, well, they don't really have a choice. So,
Yep. Yeah.
cool. All right, let's move on to outsiders then. And first sort of takes on outsiders and sealed. Is there any particular strategies that you're leading towards? Do you think some heroes look more viable than others as soon as you open up probably the average pool?
Yeah, I think for me, probably I am looking to play either Ninja or Ranger, to be honest. And it's really dependent on like what I open that would make me want to play Ranger. I think Ninja has the best weapon. So like in Flesh and Blood, like your weapon is basically like your consistency tool because you always have access to it every single turn as long as you can spend the resources. And so Ninja has, I would say, like the best kind of like rate on their weapon. You get like 1 damage for 1 resource. So as long as you have like the 0 costs to spend on resources, actually, among the 2 ninjas, I actually feel like Benji is probably the better one for sealed because Benji has a hero ability that adds damage. So even though Katsu starts the game with 3 more life, especially if you're gonna expect the game to go like long, if you can like trigger the Benji ability 3 times and it kind of like equalizes it out. And plus you have more ways to kind of close the game out with his like unblockable claws. And then my pick for Ranger would probably be Riptide, because with Ranger you really want to be going for more damage, and so like the way like Riptide's first ability that lets you put the card in your arsenal, a card from your hand into your arsenal face down, I think has like a lot of synergy with your Barb Castaway's bow because then it lets you spend the resource to give an aim counter to your arrow. And a lot of the arrows in this set get +1 damage when you put an aim counter on them. So it's another way to get like more power, like more total power into your deck.
Yeah, and I think a good thing to point out with that in sealed is that you're often not able to spend your resources efficiently. So having these like what I like to call sinks, if you've ever played Magic, mana sinks was very, very relative term, but these kind of resource sinks that can add value to what you're doing on a turn-to-turn basis, I think generally have been undervalued, and I think in the set they should be greatly looked at. So Barb Castaway in that respect looks particularly interesting to me. You pitch a blue, maybe you need 1 to pay for your 1 cost arrow, maybe a 1 cost attack, or maybe it's and then you've got this 1 left to use your Barb Castaway ability. Looks really enticing to me. What about Assassin? Why are you not particularly looking at Assassin? And is it a case of you're not looking at it at all, or is it going to be just that you think the average pool is probably not going to be Assassin exciting for you?
Yeah, so I think for Assassin, this is something that I really have to maybe play the games a little bit to get like a sense for like the feel. But the main problem that Assassin has is that most of the Assassin cards don't hit a breakpoint. So in Flesh and Blood, like a good defensive card blocks for 3. So we call a breakpoint is something that does maybe like 1 above 3. Like if you attack for 4, then they can't like block it fully out with a 3 block. So Assassin is kind of lacking in that regard. So you need to be kind of like attacking with your weapon to like debuff their blocks so that you can like kind of get in for your damage when you can. and just like the overall like amount of like cards that you play are just like not that good. I personally think that both Ozuri and Arachne, while they might be good for constructed formats, it's like they're both a lot more synergy dependent. Like we talked about earlier, like you really want to be like leaning into just like pure power for sealed. So Azuri, like you really want to have like you want if you want to do the swap, the attack with a card with stealth and you swap, you want to be swapping to an attack that is like powerful and like relevant. And in sealed, maybe you would only get like two or three of those, right? Uh Similarly for Arachne, like if gives your first stealth card go again, and having giving cards go again is really strong. But then you also have to ask yourself, well, normally I really want to be like attacking for at least like three, I think, to give it go again for it to be worthwhile. Because if you think about it, when you're blocking for three, like all the cards have go again, like you just block as many cards for three as you want. They all have three go again. So you want to be like attacking for three go again. And then so how many stealth cards with three power are you gonna have in your sealed pool to kind of take use of the hero ability?
Yeah, I think it's solitary confinement is looking more enticing to me than Azuri personally. I think in sealed and in limited in particular, I'm looking for added value from my hero, especially the lower the power of the format, the more I want to have value from my hero. That's why I completely agree with you on Benji as well. You know, if there's gonna be a lot of blocking in the game, leaking, 4 or 5 damage over the course of the game, that's actually double that amount of damage that you're presenting. So, and I kind of feel the same with like Azuri. Like unless you've opened up all these crazy 2 for 6s, you've just gotten really lucky, in which case your generic pool's probably already really good and you should probably just play Benji or Katsu anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
On the other hand, I think with solitary confinement, like I think if you have enough of these 0 for 3s stealth, I think what it does allow you to do is play out your hand offensively,
Hmm.
and that's generally better in limited because than playing it defensively, because there is a lot of block twos. So if you blocked with that card, yeah, you're defending 3 damage, but if you attack with it, you're presenting 3 damage, and if your opponent has to start to get into a position to use their hand as best as possible and defend, they're probably going to be defending with 2 blocks at some point and leaking some damage. And I think
Hmm.
the other part as well is that there are some cards I think that work really well with solitary confinement. So like Spring Loaded is a card I think that we'll probably talk about in
Oh yeah,
this.
yeah,
I
yep.
really like that card for being able to play off like 3 card hands with a weapon as well. So weapon into stealth attack into
Hmm.
Spring Loaded as a hand I think is really powerful. And I just think there is some play with solitary confinement, but yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you said Riptide, because my first take on Riptide is that it potentially looks a little bit awkward, but the more we've talked about it with like the power of Barb Castaway and leveraging that hero ability, and the traps are really good, I think I'm also leaning towards Riptide. But I think Azuri I feel is going to have the worst win rate this weekend, to be honest. Maybe Azalea, but it'll be between the two is kind of my take.
Yeah. I think, but in where what we're saying is that in all these instances, is like you just want like your hero power to give you like a little bit extra, or like a little extra something. Is
Yeah.
that it's like I think like Benji, I think maybe Riptide, and yeah, like you said, Solitary Confinement are probably the three heroes that actually can give a little bit extra during the course of the game.
Yeah, why don't we dive into the kind of classes and some of just our tips on like how to look at building and the cards you're kind of looking for? Because I think there's some more to discuss around that as well. I'm sure we can talk a bit about Katsu and what you can leverage from that hero ability. But why don't we start with the assassins? When we talk about Azuri, like if you are looking to build Azuri, maybe you really want to play Azuri, or potentially you have a pool that kind of is looking like the things that you want. What How would you build Azuri? Like what are the cards you're looking for, and how would you actually build Azuri?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is you gotta see like what your strengths are. So I think Azuri's big strength, or Assassin in general, big strength is being able to kind of use your Spider's Bite to reduce the block value of your opponent's cards. I mean, in sealed, probably like most of your opponent's cards are going to be attacks. That's just how the set is constructed. So if you want to be attacking with your weapon, then you want to be putting like a decent number of blues into your deck. I would say that Azuri is not the kind of hero that I would try to like skimp on blues, because I think they're so high value. And so like looking like we said, like 9 or 10 is like about like one every hand. I wouldn't feel bad about getting maybe like two every hand. And so I would go as high as like 15-ish, like blues, if you have the ability to. And then I would also try to put as many cards that have high power as you can, because when your opponent wants to be blocking, like you really want to be trying to get like any extra like damage in. So like you attack with a stealth attack for like 2 or 3, then your opponent gets put into like a hard situation. Like, do I overblock and waste a card maybe, or do I not overblock and then maybe I'll just take some chip damage? And so you just want to be putting your opponent into these situations as often as possible. And so having the high power cards, like you said, the 2 for 6s, maybe like 1 for 5, whatever, like spring loaded. Those are like the kinds of cards that I think are pretty good.
Yeah, I want to really reiterate what you said about blues. The spiders bites, they are strong, they are powerful, and sometimes they look like, oh, it's a bad Kadachi, right? 2 for 1. But so often your opponent just cannot justify defending that, whether it's because you're playing a 4 or 5 card hand, or it's because they have a lot of 2 blocks and they need to dedicate these to, potentially
Yeah,
defending a break point or something. It is really relevant, and so I think being able to, what having more blues does is sometimes like we talked about before, you want to utilize your whole hand, right? And if you have hands that look like 4 card hands with 2 blue, that's going to allow you to do it more often than not with Spider's Bite. Attack twice the Spider's Bite, present a threat, or maybe even play one of those blues. So the other thing I want to add is I think there's some high value blues like blue spring loaded. There's other ones out there as well that I think you want to look towards that are going to add. If you've got like 10 kind of whatever blues and then like 4 to 5 blues that you would actually play in the game, I think your deck starts to look a lot better. I also wanted to just talk about like why I would play Azuri as opposed to Solitary Confinement, because I just harped on about how much I thought Solitary Confinement was probably the better of the two. I think
yeah,
if stealth is like, if you're looking for win conditions and you have some high power attacks and those are looking like your win conditions as opposed to a lot of like 0 for 3s at red, maybe you have more yellow stealth cards, then I think Azuri becomes a lot more appealing because you've got this way to present breakpoints, like Yuanji just said, starts to put your, especially when you get to low life, your opponent gets in this predicament of like, do I have to overblock this? How do I deal with Spider's Bites plus overblocking plus, threat of Azuri activation, all these sorts of things. So the one extra life is, it's not significant, but it's not insignificant if the effect of Solitary Confinement is going to be pretty null and void for you. So I do think that there is reasons to play Azuri this weekend. It's just going to come down to what's in your pool. How many 0 for 3 stealth do you have versus how many sort of like good generic attacks and ways to like good blues do you have, I think.
yeah.
What about like cards you're on the lookout for? You talked about specifically about some of the 0 for 6s. What about, is there any other cards that you look for? Like attack reactions to me, I think if I'm looking at just Assassin in general, like I am looking for these Razor's Edge. I'm looking for these ones that trigger with stealth and then ways to utilize that. Like Sneak Attack is a card that looks really powerful to me, but you need to have the attack reactions to leverage it. Otherwise you're playing a 2 for 3 at red. So it's not ideal.
Yeah, I think in general, most of the stealth attacks that have hit triggers attached to them, I think are pretty strong. Like making like I think all of the tokens end up being pretty relevant. Maybe inertia is probably like the weakest one for limited because people aren't going to be setting up like specific plays as often. But if you can like even attack with like a yellow infect or something, and your opponent decides, oh, maybe it's not worth it for me to block, then you can get in like essentially 4 damage off of 1 card. Being able to like those are the cards that I want to try to that would push me towards wanting to play. And like you said, like attack reactions that let me go like over the top. Um, I think in conjunction with the hit triggers is pretty annoying
Mm.
to deal with. So I would try to make sure that those are the cards that I have in my pool for me to like really want to go into Zuri, and then also of course the generic like big beefy 2 for 6, 2 for 5, make a ponder, like things like that.
Yeah, Infect's a card to me that looks good at all colors. Like it blocks a 3, it presents a really relevant. Like at yellow,
Mhm.
you're threatening 0 for 4. Like it Infect is a card that I'm looking pretty high priority, I think, in Assassin. Any kind of other things you want to talk about for Assassin before we kind of move through and talk about Ranger? Is there any other cards like from a high level standpoint that like really excite you? I had put a note in about like just general cards that you might be looking for in the set when you look through your seal pool, and we kind of blaze past it.
Oh
So
yeah,
if there's
yeah.
any kind of mentions that you want to talk about just in general when you look through your seal pool, feel free to go for it.
I think in general, just like yeah, like I said, like those stealth cards that have the hit triggers, making sure that you can like get that you can push when you can. I think that all the attack reactions, like you get a really strong attack reaction in Razor's Edge, being that you create a situation where you're, let's say, like Usually like your opponent doesn't really want to overblock, because every time you overblock and then you choose not to switch your attack, you essentially like lose a card for free, as the opponent. So being able to like take advantage of those situations to like push in like a little bit more damage with either like a Razor's Edge or like a Spike with whatever,
Those cards are
Blood
so good, by
Rot,
the way.
Frailty. Yeah. So like it does. I don't think it like really even matters. Like any, I think all of the colors of the attack reactions that, especially the ones that give them a token, uh, end up like proving that to be valuable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like if you get the hit trigger.
They also defend for 3. So
Yep. Yeah. That's not like a normal thing. If you've been playing Flash and Blood for a long time, having attack reactions of luck for 3 is pretty rare.
I feel like I'm playing Warrior in Welcome to Wraithfield.
Yeah. That's true.
All right, let's jump over and talk a little bit about Ranger. Why don't we start with Azalea, because we just kind of harped on Riptide a little bit. Like, what are
Yeah.
the strategies that you see that are going to be viable with Azalea, and why would you want to play Azalea? Obviously, you don't get Death Dealer like you did in Arcane Rising. You've got Barbed Castaway this time. So why play Azalea? What does it look like?
Yeah, I think Azalea, so like the main, so both Rangers have like a way to put aim counters, as I think like the most consistent way. So I think for Riptide, the most consistent way to put an aim counter on your arrow is going to be with the Barbed Castaways, and for Azalea, it's going to be her quiver that she has. That being said, like I think the reason why you would want to play Azalea is, let's say you open like a bunch of red arrows. So like all the red arrows that have hit triggers, like there's a cycle that makes either Frailty, Blood Rot, Inertia tokens. If you get to put them into play like via Azalea's ability, and you give them Dominate, and you can also like pay 1 and use her quiver to put an aim counter. So I think they all get +1. That's like a really powerful play, and is I mean, like if you think about it, like normally, like throughout the game, like you might have to go through some hoops in order to like actually push through damage like through blocks. And Azalea provides a way for you to actually like do that, even if your opponent has cards to block with.
Hmm.
So I think that would be the reason why you would play Azalea, but I think it's a little bit less consistent. Just because like it's unlikely that you would have like the number of arrows. But if you do open like, I don't know, like 8 to 10 red arrows, maybe I would start looking at that.
I'd probably play Azalea, especially if I had 2 to 3 like good pumps as well, like red pumps.
Yeah.
Because Azalea can like the power of that hero ability is that it can be your win condition, right?
Hmm.
But more often than not, it's not going to be that, and it's going to be no, I wouldn't say useless, but it's going to be very low value, and it's also hard to use, I think, as well. So that can be kind of the issue, I think, with Azalea.
Yeah, so each ranger gets their own quiver. Riptide's quiver is kind of
The
it
foot
doesn't like
quiver,
really
yeah.
do it. It just kind of, I think, salvages you if you get a card stuck there.
Yep.
But Azalea's quiver, yeah, you just get off the bat. It's a token quiver.
Cool. I didn't realize that. So thank you,
Hmm.
Yuanji, for correcting me on that. Because I was looking at the spoiler and I was like, oh, they're common. They're not tokens. That's
You don't have to pick them.
much worse. Well, yeah, I think Crow's Nest is like definitely a lot more powerful than Driftwood Quiver. Like Crow's Nest enables what we just talked about, right?
Yeah.
And there is ways that you might also use that second ability on Barbed Castaway. Like, actually, is there reload in the set or is there no reload?
I don't think that there is reload. So like basically like the main way that you use the second ability on Barbed Castaways, I think, is with the Riptide first ability.
Hmm.
So when you get to put like a card from your hand into the arsenal face down, and then you can like flip it face up if it's an arrow and give it an aim counter.
Yep. While we're just, I just kind of scrolled across these. I'm just on like the card gallery. We didn't talk about this too much with Assassin, but what about the hybrid cards? Like, how good are some of these hybrid cards? Like a card that you were talking about cards you were looking for. Like Death Touch is like a card I'm immediately looking
Oh
for when
yeah.
I'm going through my sealed pool, because I think that card is crazy, crazy good.
I think me and some of the members on my team we were watching the box opening spoilers, and I think it was Chris Sires that was doing it like slow enough so we could like think about, oh, what's like pack one pick one. Every time he opens like Red Death Touch, we're like, that's the card. That's the card we're gonna pick. Yeah, so like Death Touch is super powerful, and is another reason like maybe that you would want to go into like a ranger or assassin. And I think it's actually quite interesting that they do it in this. So like this is, I think, one of the first sets that I feel like the direction that I'm guided to play is going to be somewhat affected by like the rares that I open, because I would say that like for a lot of Flesh and Blood sets in the past, a lot of like the power was just behind like your weapon or like your like how consistent like your cards are. But actually like a lot of the rares in this set are like very strong.
Yeah, and it's like they're not only reasonably above rate, but they also, I think because of the block value in the set, they represent more value, but also I think they just have consistent ways to enable them. Like, you look at Death Touch in this first line of tech, Death Touch can't be played from Arsenal. It's actually just irrelevant. Like, you either
Mhm.
just Arsenal the card and play it next turn, or if you're a Ranger, you have potential ways to get it in. I mean, actually, Codex is the main way, but which is a Majestic. But, like, you
Yeah,
just Arsenal this
or
card.
the Riptide ability.
Yeah,
Like you
yeah,
play
the
like a
Riptide
Ravenous
ability.
Rabble or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really powerful. Like if you have like a 3 card hand of, a go again attack into a death touch, like that, a red death touch, like that's a powerful hand.
Yeah, yeah.
What about like a card like Toxicity? This is a card that's been talked about. Like, do you think that card is potentially powerful in the right? Like that's one that comes to me. It's like, well, if I could like dominate with Azalea, that card seems pretty good.
Yeah, I think Toxicity is like one of those cards where it's going to be probably more powerful and constructed than in Limited. So in Limited, like you said, like the bottom left, like the power is going to be like the most important thing. And so while Toxicity threatens the ability to do damage, I think it's more likely than not, it's just a signal for your opponent to say, block this attack. Just you know what I mean? Like you're guiding your opponent to making the right play. They want to block the attack out and prevent uh themselves from taking 5, 4, 3 life extra.
Yep. How important do you think Go Again is for the Rangers? Like we just talked about Ravenous Rabble, for instance. There's some other ways to get Go Again. I mean, there's the equipment, which looks a little bit awkward. But hey, how
Yeah,
important? Yeah, that's the sandals.
yeah. That card I don't think works that well with a lot of the cards in the set, which is pretty interesting because you think about a card like that, like an analog in a lot of the other sets would be like one of the most powerful cards. I think Go Again is like so Ranger has a lot of Go Again in the form of non-attack actions that strengthen their next attack. And I would say that those are actually very useful, both for kind of activating the Riptide ability to like give you an arsenal. And also I think for Azalea to like if you get like an arrow with Dominate to be able to like push extra damage while your opponent can't block with their full hand. So Go Again comes in many ways, and I think that they are pretty important for Ranger. Because Ranger really wants to be like on the offensive, like right, like because you don't have a weapon, you don't want to be like on the blocking side as much. So I would say Go Again's probably more important for Ranger than the other two classes.
Yeah,
Even
I
though Ninja just gets Go Again.
that's
You
that's
don't
the
have to
trouble,
work for
right?
it. You don't have to work for it. Yeah.
Yeah, you do have to work for it in Ranger on the flip side though, and I think
Yeah.
that's going to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
the trouble that people find this weekend is trying to understand what that looks like. And one of my kind of tips I think I have is that you want to look at like realistically if the arrows you have and the pumps you have, like can you deal lethal damage? Like do you have enough damage in your deck here to be able to win the game? And then the other thing I'm looking at, to be honest, is like do my other cards like block for 3? Like if my other card, like if I'm kind of on borderline of like having enough damage in the deck, maybe I have 7-ish red arrows or something, maybe a couple of good
Yeah.
yellow ones and a couple of like good red pumps. But then like all my other cards like defend for 2. It's gonna be really hard for me to like get through the game, I think, and get to the points where I can finish my opponent if all my other cards that I want to throw away on the defensive side are 2 blocks. Like you're gonna need some 3 blocks to make sure that you aren't having to use your because you don't want to be blocking with those red arrows. Like that is a death sentence. I think that's
Yeah.
a tip I want to give. Like you do not want to be defending with those cards because how are you going to win the game?
I actually did the math before this.
Oh, here we go.
If you're like assuming like so most of the generics in the set block for 2 and then most of the class cards block for 3. So assuming like your opponent gets like 2.5 block on average, then they can block for 75-ish damage. If they just like decide I'm just never gonna attack you, I'm just gonna block the whole game. So your deck actually has to provide at least like I would say like around 90, like realistically around like 95 to 100 damage over the course of the game. And so like Ranger doesn't get any of that from like your weapon, right? Uh and so like there's this like yeah, like you said like if you block with like a red arrow, that red arrow maybe represents 6 damage, like you're gonna run into some issues later on in the game. So yeah, I think for that reason, like you really want to try to maximize your offensive potential that you can.
Yep. That's the other reason I think Azalea is potentially I know we talked about the strength of Riptide, but Azalea looks to me like if you have the cards to play it, that hero ability is going to be really relevant. And it might be more relevant in draft than sealed, to be honest, in terms of,
Mhm.
just the way you can build into it and support it. But, if you're able to reduce that, say, I don't need to present 90 damage, I only need to present 50 damage because of Dominate, or 40 damage because of like these, I can string together maybe 3 or 4 like big Dominate attacks. And I'm talking like, double pump into an arrow or something, or 4 to 5 card hands. You're going to win the game with a couple of really good turns. And I think that is viable. It's going to be harder in sealed, but I really do see it becoming a thing in draft.
Oh yeah. Before we get off the topic, one card that we were talking about, hybrid cards that you really want to be looking for if you do decide to play Ranger, is Virulent Touch. So Virulent Touch is a common. It costs 0, but being able to, it's kind of like unblockable damage, because if your opponent blocks with a card, then they get a Bloodrot Pox token. So like no matter what, like they're gonna have to be like using they're either gonna like take 2 damage off of it, or they're gonna have to be like saving like another card to prevent the damage. So it's just like you want to find as many ways as possible to kind of bypass like your opponent's like block strategy.
Yeah, there's a reason that card defends for 2, I think. Same with Death
Yeah,
Touch.
that's
Like
quite strong.
these cards are good. Yeah, so I think that's one thing to touch on before we move on. I do have one last question about Rangers for you, but unblockable damage is a bit of a theme of the set. We don't have arcane damage, but we have Benji's ability, we have Dominate, we have Bloodrot Pox tokens, we have a few different ways to seek, ways to throw daggers at people. We have a bit of this like unblockable, what we call evasion damage, right? And I think getting those into your deck if you can is really important. Like a Bloodrot Pox token, when you're coming in with like a hand of like 2 or 3 cards, is basically unblockable damage. Like your opponent's not going to be able to have that blue to give up for it unless they're doing nothing on their turn and having no arsenal. Like it's presenting a real big problem for your opponents. So that's why Virulent Touch, like you just talked about, I think the pumps, just going back to Ranger, are super important, and the arrows that have those on hit effects that provide, especially Bloodrot Pox, but even the not inertia. What's the third one?
Oh, Frailty.
Frailty. Sorry, yeah, that Frailty it does add up, especially against the assassins and ninjas.
Yep.
One last question for you is, how good are traps, Yuanji, when it comes to Ranger?
I think traps are really good. Actually, I think traps are like the primary reason. It's like a weird situation to be in, where I think Ranger also kind of blocks the best. Because the traps are all defense reaction type, they don't get affected by Spider's Bite. So you kind of have some counterplay against like what both Assassin and Ninja are trying to like do to you. I think in particular, all the traps that proc off of your opponent playing something with Go Again are really good, because that's what those 2 classes like to do. And so we were talking about unblockable damage. So like if you can fit in like a couple of like traps into your deck, it's like a way for you to like push through the like the extra like last like points of damage, right? Flesh and Blood is always a game about, there's like different phases. So like towards the beginning of the game, people are more likely to be able to be willing to like trade life, but you want to have ways to kind of push like the last little bit, like if your opponent it starts to put up the shields up and make themselves hard to kill. So like having ways to make like Bloodrot Pox tokens, having ways to trigger damage off of like traps, those are things that you really want to have in your deck to kind of close the game out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the one. I also forgot about Riptide, obviously, with the hero ability. When you do trigger a trap, important to remember for your pre-release, you have to trigger the trap to get the damage, not just play the trap.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's move on to finish it out with the ninjas. We talked about Benji and the strengths of. I mean, unless there's anything else you want to say about Riptide. Obviously, we spent most of the time there on Azalea, but is there anything else you want to say about Riptide?
Riptide just looks cool. I don't know. Play Riptide.
I agree. I've been claiming for the past 3 weeks that I'm going to be a Riptide main. I fortunately I think I'm going to have to renege on that comment, but I'll play it in limited.
Yeah. Let's talk about Ninja.
All right, Katsu, what are you looking to do? I mean, the kind of old school Katsu approach was either, in sealed was like either you got a little bit lucky and you got a couple of good like combo lines to utilize your hero ability. Again, talking about the strength of hero abilities, or it was the classic like Kadachi attrition. Just play Kadachis with your best like power, like again bottom left hand corner, the biggest number, and just Kadachis and blues.
Yeah, I think if you want to be doing that kind of Kadachi-based strategy, like you really need to have a lot of 3 blocks. Unfortunately, Ninja is the class where most of your class cards are going to block for 2 rather than 3. And so like Assassin and Ranger, like almost all of their attacks, especially like the ones at common rarity, are gonna block for 3. A lot of the ninja, uh, I think this is like how they balance it. A lot of the ninja cards block for 2. And on the flip side, they have Go again, so they're like good on offense. But I think they LSS has designed the set in a way that probably like fatigue Katsu is less viable. And so I would be more looking for like strong combo lines to make sure that like, oh, I can like use my ability. Speaking of rares that are like really strong or like outperform their counterparts, like a card like Bonds of Ancestry is just like really strong, especially like in Katsu, where you can pretty reliably, I guess, look for it. Like any zero cost card, if you do get to land a hit with an attack action, then you can like turn into like one of your most powerful cards, right? So that's like kind of what the strength of Katsu is. If you do have like some of these like powerful combo lines, I think it's worth looking at.
The set, like the more and more I get into the limited facets of the set, and obviously, this is limited time only. We're gonna be doing it a lot for the next 10 weeks, but there is the design kind of waiting on the set for limited feels already a lot better to me than it has in previous sets in terms of like you just talked about the balancing aspects of things. You just pointed out traps before, and the ability as a ranger to have the sort of probably the best sort of way to defend, assassin having these kind of interplays, and then ninja having like the worst kind of average defense rate is really interesting. So yeah, I think my kind of takeaway for Katsu is, I'm looking at these combo lines as well, and I'm looking at what I have in terms of, a couple of really strong ones to leverage that Katsu ability. But the other card that I want to talk about as well is like Be Like Water, which is this card that I
Oh
think is
yeah.
really important to Limited because it helps you fix some of the issues that Katsu has traditionally had with combo lines in Limited, which is you just open all the wrong pieces, right? I have all these, I have Bonds of Ancestry and, what's it called? The Gust Wave card, Descendant Gust Wave, but I've got no Surging Strikes, for instance. Well, all of a sudden, actually, I've opened 2 red Be Like Water. Those can be my Surging Strikes. Like, Be Like Water, I think, is going to help us fix a lot of Katsu's combo problems for Limited.
Yeah, I agree. I think Be Like Water. It's funny that you say that because I actually think it ends up being like a little better for Benji. So Be Like Water, you have to like be able to hit with it. So like actually like Yellow Be Like Water in Benji, I think is quite strong for that reason. You get to like play out your combo lines, plus you get to like trigger the Benji ability to give a +1.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, makes sense. But even, I mean, like even if you open like yellow Surging Strike in your pool and red Descendant Gust Wave, like that on a 3-card hand with a blue, that's like 9
Oh
damage.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
you're just
yeah,
presenting good
really
damage, I think,
strong.
with some of these cards, which is really cool. And yeah, I mean, Be Like Water, yeah,
Yeah,
you do have to hit, but also like, yeah, I think with Benji, like you talked about with yellow or even I guess like blue, like that represents like quite a good way to turn on some of these combos. Because let's not forget, just because Katsu has the hero ability, like Benji's going to be utilizing these combo cards really, really efficiently.
yeah. I think that so we said that before it seems difficult for a lot of the classes to fully utilize their hand on offense. And I think that Ninja is kind of the exception to that. So one thing that you might want to consider if you're playing pre-release is like what class you're playing against, because Ninja, almost all their class cards do have the ability to go again, and so them going second, it is more likely that they'll be able to put together like a 4-card hand or a 3-card hand plus an arsenal, and so I think that is part of the pull of wanting to play Ninja is just being able to do that, being able to play out all your cards on offense, where the other 2 classes kind of rely on blocking a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Any other kind of like thoughts on Katsu? Like any other cards you're particularly looking at? Like, I guess my question might be like, why play Katsu as opposed to Benji, other than the 3 life? Like maybe you don't have enough cards that can utilize that Benji text line, or you don't have enough breakpoints. Is that maybe why you don't play Benji?
So I think for Katsu, yeah, it's just like I think if you have like really strong combo lines and then you also have like the attack reactions, I think there's a assassin ninja hybrid attack reaction that's kind of like a razor reflex type card in the set.
Yes, I'm finding it
It's
now.
called short and sharp.
Yep, that's the one. Short and sharp. Costs
Yeah.
1, and it's like Razor Reflex without the go again.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that if you do have so like it doesn't take like because you start with 20 life or less in a limited, it doesn't take that many like really powerful turns to like put your opponent into like I gotta block like every single like all my cards every single turn. Like you put together one like really strong turn. And I think Katsu has the ability to do that if you have the cards in your pool. So cards like Bonds of Ancestry, if you have multiple of the what is it? The I want to say Hurricane Kick, but it's I don't think that's what it is. Like
Oh, the I'm looking at the roundhouse kick. Sorry, spinning wheel kick.
yeah, that spinning wheel kick. So if you can chain together like two or three of those, right? Like because Katsu lets you tutor for that for those power cards. You only need like one turn where your opponent's like, oh, I think I have a pretty good turn. I'm not gonna block. You can put together like 12, 13 damage, then they are gonna have to like start blocking pretty much like their whole hand. And that's really where Kodachis end up shining when you have your opponent on like the defensive. And so I think those would be like the reasons. Like you really have like the high power combo cards and you want to try to like utilize them every turn or every game.
I mean, let's not forget as well, even if your opponent does want to defend, on average, probably 10 block is probably going to be about where they land. And
Yeah.
sometimes they're going to land at 8, sometimes they're going to maybe land at like 11 if they've got a trap or maybe 2 class cards, but often they're going to be at like 9 to 10. And if you've got a 13, 14 damage turn, maybe like 15 actually looks really reasonable with Katsu off a 5 card hand, I think, with Kodachi damage. It's like
Mhm.
you're going to all of a sudden leak damage, they're going to have no hand, you get tempo back, maybe you leak a little bit more damage, and you're like in the driver's seat. So I think, if you can leverage that Katsu ability, it's a really good option to look at. Go to Benji. Like, what are the cards you're looking at for Benji to like? How actually? First question: how important is leveraging the first ability versus like the second ability? Like, how important is that +1 leak, like you talked about, as opposed to the unblockable damage?
I think the +1 is going to end up being the more important ability. The unblockable is kind of just like a nice to have. So like it ends up being so a lot of like the really powerful hit triggers that you have in Ninja. Like if you play Katsu, like I think it's like Recoil. Is Recoil the one that you get to put a card on top of your opponent's deck?
Yeah, for hits.
Like
Yeah,
that's like a very strong ability. It's essentially adding on an extra like two or three like value onto your attack. So Benji being able to kind of like force those hit triggers through, or like we said, be like water. It like turns on like if you turn into a surging strike, your descending gust wave gets like a +2, right? So it's like converting some of your like yellows and blues into like more power than you otherwise normally would have. So that's like a bonus. But I think that like just getting the extra one on like a hard to block turn, like you attack with a 1 for 4 go again. I think there's two spinning wheel kick and twin twisters, both can be like 1 for 4 go agains. Those are hard cards to block. Your opponent's gonna have to like block 2 cards on it, in which case like you're already getting the value, or like you're converting them into like basically like a 1 for 5 go again, which is absurd.
huge. Yeah, huge value. Yeah, I think the thing with Benji is you want to focus on that +1 ability. The unblockable ability is like really important, especially in like in-game situations, I think. But in in-game situations, you're gonna have a lot of blues and yellows in your deck left that you effectively get to turn some of your like chaff, your like pitch chaff into effects that are gonna leak damage. And when you're like, Kodachi, your opponent's like, do they have the unblockable card? I probably have to block these Kodachis because I'm on 3 life here, or one of them at least. Like, it starts to become really, really relevant. So, yeah, I agree. I think Benji recaps like the breakpoint cards, like you just talked about, those 4 attacks, and then it's like some of these decent yellows that have on hit effects as well.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be like an interesting like situation because when you do play Ninja, you're not going to have the block value to kind of stop your opponent's like arrows that have hit triggers, or you're not gonna be able to stop your opponent's like stealth attacks that have hit triggers. So it's like really can you like output enough damage to make it so that your opponent isn't in a good spot to leverage the fact that you have weak defenses.
Mhm. Yeah, and then it's a real balancing act because also, you know, how consistent are these hands? Like, how consistent are they? We're talking about these powerful hands. You can have, these stealth hands, these hands with the combo lines, for example. Like, how consistently can you pull these together? Like we're talking
Mhm.
sealed here. Like, it's not draft where you can draft into this archetype and get repetitive consistency in the deck. It's going to be a lot harder to put together. So, yeah, I'm really interested to see. I want to end with a couple of quick questions, Yuanji.
Yeah.
Let's talk about equipment for a second. Like, we talked about, I asked you at the top of the show, like how important it is. What specific equipment are you looking at as particularly important equipment in the set? Ones that, if you do open them, they are like, how good are these? I call them Quell Light. What are they called?
Oh, the
Yeah, the
Seekers.
Seekers
Uh,
line of equipment. Like, how good are these?
uh, those I think are the weakest, although probably like not too bad in Azalea. If you, because like Azalea, like we said, it's like a little bit less consistent to like use the hero power for effect. However, if you do like get some opts, I think that's when it changes a little bit.
Yep.
Um, I think for the most part, the equipments that you really want to play are going to be like the blade break equipment. And actually, like to be honest, I haven't played the games of limited yet, but I have a feeling that most of the time the blade break is going to be like the most relevant part of the card. Just being able to like block for a point of damage against Kadachis or like against like a break point, I think will be pretty useful. Uh, and historically, any chess piece that gives you a resource is pretty strong in limited, but have to see because the format seems a little bit less focused on like really like finding big tempo plays
Yeah.
as before. So unsure, but at first glance, I would say that like trying to assemble like as many like blade break equipments because it's just like extra health points in addition to being able to help you block effects.
Yep. Yeah, I think those are going to be really important. We just harped on about breakpoints and how relevant those are going to be in certain decks. And I agree. I think this format, my kind of overall take to start with the seal format, is it's a lot about edging out and winning turn cycles and finding the kind of rhythm of the game as opposed to like big tempo swings, like you say. I think that's going to be really important. One thing I do want to say on like Seeker's Gillet is, or like any of these Seeker's cards, is we didn't talk about, I think it's Peace of Mind, which is the generic that costs 2 and like prevents damage. Like
Oh
that
yeah, yeah.
that is a card that like potentially obviously looks a lot better if you do have a Seeker's piece of equipment, and particularly in Azalea, like I think there's going to be, maybe it's going to be more of a draft thing, but I can see decks where it's like, a third of my deck is like these big powerful arrow and arrow buff win conditions that I'm trying to build towards, and then the rest of my deck is just good ways to get to that, and Opt is a good way to get to that as well.
Yeah, I agree. This is something that I carried over. So like an uprising, you have you also had like an instant that you could play defensively in Oasis Respite. So I think in general, like yeah, like you said, any time that you have something that you want to like, I guess like spend resources on, I always try to like make it so that you can add up to like 3 resources spent. So having like at least like one piece of Seekers for every piece of mind that you're playing is probably a good idea.
Yep, I'm on board. I think that covers equipment. I guess like last thing is how good is I want to talk about a couple of generics quickly. Give me your thoughts on Seek Horizon, Spring Load, and Come to Fight.
I think Seek Horizon is probably just going to end up being played for the most part without like putting a card on top for go again. Red one is really strong. Just being able to have like 4 damage on a card to kind of end your attacks, I think is really strong. What were the other ones that you mentioned?
Give me Come to Fight. Your thoughts on Come to Fight, because that's a card that I've traditionally very much liked. It blocks 3.
Hmm.
It's a pump.
Yeah, I think Come to Fight is actually really good. So Come to Fight I think is really good because it is honestly like it kind of functions like a defense reaction in this set, especially like
Spider's Bite.
against Assassin because Spider's Bite only debuffs attack action. So unless your opponent got lucky and opened like a majestic weapon, like you're for the most part like you're only gonna have your attacks get debuffed. So in a lot of instances, like having like a non-tech action that blocks for 3 is kind of like the same thing as having like a defense reaction. And so in that sense, like all of the colors I think are playable. And then for Riptide, just being able to like play, you can like play from your hand and then like set up your arsenal and just like tack on extra damage or like Azalea if you have a dominate arrow. Yeah, just like in general, like pretty strong effect.
Yeah, I think Red Come to Fight might be a pack one pick one contention. To be honest, I think that card
Maybe.
is it's just really versatile. And we talked about this format being difficult to leverage your whole hand. Not only does it get around Spider's Bite, it defends 3, but it also just on offense allows you to pump these on hit effects that then cause your opponent to have issues defending them. So, maybe I'm overstepping a little bit saying it's pack one pick one. I mean, maybe there's a lot of like powerful class specific and hybrid cards, but maybe in a weaker
Yeah.
pack, like it is a card that I think is you're gonna want.
Yeah. That yeah, definitely.
What about Spring Load? It's the last card I kind of mentioned. It's a card that I've liked the look of, just that kind of ability, especially in Assassin. It looks quite, in Solitary Confinement at least, looks quite enticing.
Yeah, I think this is like a card that is probably best in Assassin. It's kind of interesting. So like you would think that like in Ninja it should be like pretty decent because like let's say you can do like 3 card hand, or three you can do a 2 card hand, Kadachi like this card. But most of the Ninja cards don't block well, so it's like you don't really want to be blocking uh with like the rest of your cards. This like a card like this like really shines when you get to kind of play it as like you just have this plus like a resource card so that you get like the buff off of it, right? So I think Spring Load is actually quite strong. Um, yeah, I think for Assassin, for Benji, it'll probably just be like maybe you play the blue ones just for pitch, and then maybe you can get in like the unblockable damage even if you don't get the buff.
Yep.
I don't know. It is quite versatile. I think will have use cases for all the heroes.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see. Cool. Well, Yuanji, I want to say a massive thank you for joining me on episode 1 of Limited Time Only, Arsenal Pass Limited Time Only. Before we sort of bounce off, how many pre-releases are you playing this weekend? And then I just want to give you the opportunity again to just shout out your social platforms and, of course, the projects you've been working on. Go and check out Yuanji's deck tech from Auckland, by the way. That deck was sweet.
Thank you. I'm probably gonna play like 2 or 3 pre-releases, depending on the scheduling, and I'm pretty excited to try the new set out. I want to thank you for having me on the podcast. It was a lot of fun just getting to talk about Outsiders. And yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. I think it's at Yuanji Li. And also we're the Runaways TCG channel, TCG Runaways channel on YouTube, and also not super active on Twitter, but we're going to be a little bit more active. So just make sure that you follow. We try to post. We don't post that often, but everything that we do post, try to make sure that it's pretty high level.
Cool. Well, if you've enjoyed this pod as well, make sure you check out on the main pod, the Arsenal Pass pod. We've got the set review that's just dropped as well around the same time as this pod, where myself and Brendan go through all of our initial takes, give our grades for the limited cards, and then you can look back in a couple weeks' time and see how terribly wrong we were, like me with Aether Ice Vein and Limited. So make sure to check that out, and I'll be back next week with another great limited guest as we break down post this sealed format and we start to look towards draft. So again, Yuanji, thanks for coming on, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.